Full confession with me and Costa, who's my guest here today. I'll explain more about the nickname in a second. For the organizers, they just sort of said, okay, you guys just do your thing. We know that you guys will have some interesting things to say about AI, data center demand, and the future of the planet. But when I looked at some of the topics for the conference a couple days ago, I realized Kristina Costa knows like way more than I do about any of these things. And so I pitched the organizer, can I just interview Costa? And so I'm gonna put her on the spot. I gave her some heads up on this, but just so you know, it was gonna be more of a conversation until we realized that she just knows a lot more than I do. I'll reflect on some of my experiences working with you. Speaking today in my capacity as a professor here at Duke University, though now chief economist at OpenAI. First, I want to introduce Kristina Costa, though. She's currently the managing director for policy at the University of Chicago's Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. I knew Kristina actually as Costa for when we worked in the White House. And so the first couple months, actually, I did not know her first name because her nickname, people kept talking about this elusive Costa who was going to solve all of our problems, who was going to come talk to me about the future of climate and energy. And we had not worked together in previous administrations. We had been in different departments. And so when we finally met, I think on Zoom was when the first time I saw that your name was Kristina. Kristina had a bunch of big jobs, but I'll read a couple of them. She was Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of the White House Office of Clean Energy Innovation and Implementation. The most important thing there, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is you oversaw the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really, Costa, I mean, the reason that we all got together 2 years ago to think about how that was going to be implemented. When you did that, a bunch of big numbers, and I'm sort of jealous because the CHIPS Act is smaller than these numbers. So I'm going to say this, though. $100 billion in federal grants is something you oversaw, 23 different clean energy tax provisions. And it's funny, when you read this on an intro like this, and it says 23 clean energy tax provisions, it seems so easy to write. But I remember each one in painstaking detail. When you're working through these tax credits, and this is true for any administration that's involved in the tax system, I mean, it's just a crazy process, right? And you did 23 of these, which is really...
And we had 96 tax credit guidance documents
96
to do those 23 credits.
We spent a lot of time together on some of these. And some of these were relevant to the work I was doing.
Ronnie had 1 credit.
I had 1 credit. One credit. This is why I'm interviewing her. I'm telling you, 1 credit to 23. And more than $400 billion in private sector investment came from the work you did. So I do want to spend our time reflecting on the moment that we're in, but also how it connects to your prior experience. Working in the White House during the Inflation Reduction Act period, it was really a moment that we all felt. We're in a moment today where there's a lot of opportunity, different political configuration. What are the lessons that you have from your experience that you're bringing today to the work at the University of Chicago? What's different? What's the same? How should people think about it?
Yeah, well, I want to start by seconding Ronnie's effusive thanks for the organizers of Billions Trillions. I can't remember if this is my second or third outing for Billions Trillions, but it's always a really wonderful event, really well put together and always extremely topical. And of course, as Ernie was just reflecting, this has been an area of a lot of shifting sands over the last several years, and so I think it's a real testament to the Duke community and to the organizers of this event in particular that it has been able to remain so timely, so relevant, so topical. Ronnie, you shouldn't be too jealous of my numbers because, of course, your boy is alive. Chip is out there in the world doing well, and Ira is a little bit wounded. But I would say that the death of the Inflation Reduction Act has been somewhat exaggerated, although it has certainly been kneecapped in multiple ways, which we can get into. I think that what is really remarkable about this topic and the moment that we're in is how much has changed since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in August of 2022, and how much has not changed, right? So in August of 2022, this was before ChatGPT was on the market.
That's right. That's right.
Think back to a time when not every conversation was about AI or data center growth. And that was the context in which not only was the Inflation Reduction passed, but the provisions of the law were debated sort of between the time President Biden took office and the bill was actually passed. You know, much of what was in the Inflation Reduction Act originated in Build Back Better, for everyone who remembers that old chestnut. A bunch of it was supposed to pass in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We used to joke we had sort of 3 uncles, Bill, Chip, and Ira, who would sit on the porch together with 3 very different personalities. Some of the energy provisions made it into the bipartisan infrastructure law, but many, many did not. They were sort of left on the cutting room floor for later passage. And I think, animating those conversations at that time were concerns about jobs, concerns about equity, as we just heard very strongly from Secretary Moniz, I think very helpfully. Questions about how to deal with climate change and resilience and reliability, and questions about how to ensure America's continued competitiveness in a global economy and a rapidly changing global energy system. And those are still really many of the topics that are animating the issue today. I think, with perfect foresight, you would have seen a slightly different Inflation Reduction Act in some critical ways if sort of Congress had known what was coming down the pike from Silicon Valley, from these hyperscalers, particularly around investments in the grid.
Interesting.
Because I think we ran a massive experiment in 2.5 years of implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, and we saw that the theory of very nice carrots, a nice carrot salad, if we want to continue Ernie's metaphor, can really work to bring capital off of the sidelines, to deploy capital really rapidly. That $400 billion is announcements that we were able to attribute to the Inflation Reduction Act, so it is almost certainly an undercount in that 2.5-year period. That is a massive shift in investment in a relatively short period of time, in response to policy signals from the federal government, in response to policy signals from this legislation. And so we saw that there are policy tools that can work extremely effectively to deploy particularly mature clean energy technologies rapidly and at scale. And in sort of the 2 full years that we had in 2023, 2024, we were setting records for clean energy deployment onto the grid in this country each year. I think the number for 2024 was that we deployed roughly 50 gigawatts between, especially a lot of utility scale solar. We were breaking records for battery storage. Wind was struggling for a variety of reasons. But we were sort of seeing this acceleration of investment. What we didn't have as robustly as would have been ideal, and what I think a lot of grid operators are struggling with now and utilities are struggling with now, were as many policy supports for upgrading the lines, the superstations, the grid management, and integrating, certainly interregional transmission, but not only interregional transmission, integrating all of that new power effectively into the grid. And so, I think that despite the rhetoric coming from this administration, the sort of culture war fever that they are gripped by against renewables in particular, you don't really see as much of a slowdown in investment. And in fact, you saw an acceleration of investment at the end of last year as project developers sought to lock in their tax treatment and commence construction on projects before the rules changed on January 1st. And so you're going to continue to see deployment at scale of new clean generating assets. What everyone I think is struggling with now is this rise in data center load growth. It became very obvious to us sort of in late 2023 into 2024 that this was going to be a challenge. We were starting to contend with it. Obviously, something happened and we didn't end up being the ones to grapple with it. But I think those same animating principles were going to be the things that would have animated our response to the data center driven load growth. And I do just want to say, and you know this perfectly well, right now, S&P, there are many projections of what to expect from data centers. I think there's a lot of speculation. I think there's a lot of hype, not unlike in some of the technologies that we were implementing. So it's a little hard to, handicap what is actually likely to happen. But S&P right now is projecting that demand on the power grid just from data centers is going to triple between now and 2030, which is
Yeah.
a lot to grapple with.
Yeah.
So.
Wow, okay, I want to double click on a few things you said. It's so interesting to look back at that period, 22 and 23, about what we thought we knew and what we didn't know.
Yeah.
Because, seated kind of adjacent to you, I was thinking about the CHIPS Act, as you mentioned, and AI has obviously changed the entire conversation over chips. Mm-hmm. But the conversation we were having then, I still remember when ChatGPT came out in 2022, we were in the offices and a bunch of people were reading each other poems they had written on ChatGPT. That, by the way, as someone who's written about how ChatGPT is used, that was the first use case, apparently, was poetry.
Which is so depressing on some level, right?
So people were reading these poems. I was trying to figure out what they were doing, but I did not connect that work that I was doing on the CHIPS Act right away to what was happening with AI until it started to develop. And in 23 and 24 is really when it started to become much more apparent. What were you seeing on data center demand during that period if you look back? Where were the signals coming from? It'd be really interesting. I think folks would probably want to know, you're sitting there in a policy role, what data are you looking at? What's coming on the horizon? Looking back now, if you knew where this conversation was going to go, would you have organized your team differently? Would you have connected with different agencies? How would you have thought about that just in that moment? Because I thought a lot about that with the CHIPS Act.
Yeah, well, and I think, what would we have done differently? So I think that I think we would have done a couple of things a little bit differently, although I think in many ways the approaches that we were taking for just enabling greater integration of clean energy resources onto the system are as relevant now as they were then. Mm-hmm. We actually, it's an undertold story, or a less understood story than you might think. We spent a lot of time internally trying to improve and streamline federal permitting. And one of the things that we did was, had the Department of Energy, for instance, exercise authority under the Federal Power Act it had never used before. I think it was Section 214A or something. Don't quote me. To better coordinate permitting across the federal agencies of interstate, interregional transmission lines, right? This is an authority that had never been used before. We had, again, as part of the original idea, we'd wanted to move permitting reform alongside the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act because of the rules of reconciliation as they were then understood. I think they have since been upended somewhat in terms of what can pass muster in reconciliation. Those could not move alongside the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we had to sort of rely on executive authority for the large part to try to accelerate permitting at the federal level. And actually, between things like this Department of Energy authority, we got $1 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act for permitting across the federal agencies, which we could use to hire personnel, to upgrade technology systems. We had, sort of regional offices that were still literally taking permit applications. You remember this very painfully. We're taking permit applications back and forth on CD-ROMs. If you were lucky, they were on CD-ROMs. And so, upgrading those technologies, passing sort of new regulations under NEPA, setting page limits, setting shot clocks, all of the kinds of things that go around. We actually cut times for the most complex federal environmental reviews by 23% by the end of the administration relative to the time that those kinds of reviews were taking in the first Trump administration. And so, I think permitting is still sort of a watchword at the forefront for everybody on dealing with load growth, dealing with data center siting, dealing with bringing new energy online. And, I think probably we would have talked about it more, I guess. I don't know. Nobody ever believed us, but it was happening if you look at the data. I think I'm really interested in what is going to happen in this administration. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, is is working on a rulemaking related to data center flexibility, which I think, obviously Duke has done a lot of really, really important work on. How that rulemaking comes out is going to be really interesting, and it's one of the few things I would say that has happened in this administration that I've been like, yeah, we might have wanted to do something similar to that in a Joe Biden too, or in a Kamala Harris administration. But I think, again, this idea of grid upgrades, investments, incentives to grid operators to incorporate grid enhancing technologies, to incorporate greater flexibility of demand management. We're always kind of bubbling along and as you heard from Ernie, these aren't like new ideas. These are things that have been worked on for a long time. And it's just now there is such pressure and urgency to do it that I think we would have spent more time in those areas. Unfortunately, unlike in the deployment and investment space, I did not have tax incentives for the private sector to drive those things, yes. Right? We had this, and still have, I should say, because it was not repealed by the Republican reconciliation bill last year, a tax credit for manufacturing of certain energy components. It's called 45X. It's the Advanced Manufacturing Production Tax Credit. It drove huge amounts of investments into domestic manufacturing of solar components, of wind components, of batteries especially. There were no provisions in that production tax credit for grid components. Why? And it's because at the time, in 2022, people didn't see that this stress on the grid was going to be coming. And so I think that we're in a moment right now where we know that if we had some of those tools, we could see a very different investment picture and a very different deployment picture. And I would hope that the Congress would be thinking seriously about that, since I think they're feeling the heat right now, and you heard this a little bit last night. They're feeling the heat from electricity demand and prices.
This is very interesting. I want to focus now on the current moment a little bit and ask you two questions about policy going forward.
Yeah.
One is, I think, around the forecasting for data center demand. You mentioned a little bit that the S&P estimate, but how you said, look, we have to be careful about over-interpreting these estimates. How can policymakers, people who are sitting in your shoes in the federal government, state and local, how can they sort of make sure that we avoid the risk of overbuilding in response to these, or underbuilding, depending on the situation? What would you advise them to do in terms of sort of their posture now, having done those kind of jobs before?
Yeah, it's really, really challenging, right? And I think they're all pretty keenly aware of that challenge because there are a lot of speculative investments in the pipelines, that in sort of the project pipelines that utility commissions, that RTOs have to look at as they're thinking about, granting interconnections. I think that, there are opportunities now to continue to try to reform how those entities think about prioritizing interconnection, how they assess, and this is a question back to you a little bit, assessing financial readiness, investability, right? When you're in these jobs in the government, you have companies coming in to you all of the time promising you the sun, the moon, and the stars if only you give them exactly what they want. And you have to weigh kind of all of the things that you're hearing against each other and against the impartial data that you get, whether it's from the Energy and Information Administration or from other, other data resources that are not driven by lobbyists, because you can, on occasion, somebody will come in with a really persuasive story, and they're honestly full of shit. And your job is to assess, whether to move heavens and earth for them to enable that investment, or whether the thing is not going to materialize. And I think, it's easy for folks to get bamboozled, I think especially in times of economic uncertainty, in times of sort of social uncertainty. This is not, I'll pick on this because it's not in either of our areas, but who remembers the Foxconn plan in Wisconsin, right? That was supposed to create I don't know how many jobs in Wisconsin, right? They got all of, the state and the local authorities gave them all kinds of concessions on tax, concessions on permitting, really upset the local community who were really worried about pollution and noise and disruption and all of these things. And, it eventually got built. It employed a tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people that they were originally saying that it was going to. But now the state and the locality aren't going to get the tax revenue from it for decades because of all of the concessions that they gave in order to attract the investment. So you have to, this is much more a task for state and local governments usually than it is for the federal government to achieve this balancing act. But I think that, in all kinds of sectors, you see that giving away the farm in order to attract the investment is not always, doesn't always end up being a long-term positive for a local community.
So I feel like we could talk about this for a long
Yeah.
time. I'll say just two things to your point. One is, working in government and working at a university, I think the two things I've seen is the access to quality data is really, really important.
Yeah.
When you're doing these jobs, you often, hopefully you're in a job where you have a lot of prior background knowledge, expertise. Costa and I both did for the different jobs we did, but things change so fast and there's new trends that you wouldn't have anticipated, evidenced by what you're talking about. And so when you can have, like the reports you mentioned from Duke and other universities, Chicago, coming out where you understand that these are scholars who've analyzed the data, right? You understand where their funding sources have come from, kind of what they've done before. That can be really, really important for government officials, no matter where you sit in the government, what political party you're from. The second thing is the government has lots of experts who are career civil servants. And so as you think about, but if you think about when I had to learn about the lumber industry, I would go to the basement of the Commerce Department and talk to people about that. And so I think,
and then the ag department would hear about it and be mad.
Well, it's always a back and forth. But that kind of expertise is really important, and the data flows in the government is really important. All things we can talk more about. One last question on policy, then I want to wrap up with two more personal questions. Policy guardrails more broadly. I think everyone in this audience is hoping, and I hope, that AI is something that's positive for the climate, not negative in all the ways people are worried about. This is really complicated. What are just some policy guardrails that you're thinking about that we should be looking at over the next several years? This administration at the federal level, but also state and local, to make sure that's kind of a more sort of likely reality and outcome.
Yeah, so I think one thing that is really important is that AI tools can be incredibly effective when they are utilized basically by experts in service of accelerating the kinds of analyses that they need to do. And the reason that I stress by experts is because you still need to check it, right? You need to be able to check the outputs. You need to have the knowledge and the context to be able to pressure test whether, if for instance, I know there are folks who are very excited about the possibility of using AI tools, or I think actually really we should be calling them machine learning tools in these kinds of contexts, to use machine learning tools to do things like accelerate the rate at which you can conduct studies for interconnection, right? For sort of pressure testing whether you can bring load onto a given grid or new resource onto a given grid and how that all works. Right now, in many RTO regions in the country, doing these studies takes a very long time. It takes a lot of engineers, and it's reasonable for it to take a bunch of time and engineers because the worst thing that could happen is you rush it or you do a bad job and the grid goes down. You have then failed at your one job, right? And so there's a lot of excitement about doing it in this way, but you can't remove the human decision maker and you can't remove the expert analysis from that. And I think that's kind of in the fever dream hype cycle, there's a thought that you can, and I think that will probably work out pretty badly. And I think that that's in the power sector. If you start looking at military applications of these tools, it becomes an even more heightened thing. So I think the question becomes, how can AI and machine learning tools be sort of expertise enhancing?
Yes.
And expertise accelerating, but not expertise replacing.
And by the way, there's fundamental, that is the key economic question as well. That's been the thing I spent a lot of time on. Just one last question on AI's application and something about maybe some advice for students in the audience. When you think about AI's applications to unlock sort of opportunities in climate science, I'm seeing these amazing results in physics, in math, using AI. I know some of your colleagues at the University of Chicago are working on this as well as it relates to the weather. Where are you seeing interesting opportunities there on the AI applications on climate science?
Yeah, and this is utterly related to the point I was just making. So at the University of Chicago, we have this really exciting project that is part of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth called the Human-Centered Weather Forecasting Initiative. And basically, an interdisciplinary team that we funded of climate scientists, a couple of economists, a couple of public health folks, came together and really worked on an AI-enhanced model of the Indian monsoon to start. Can we improve the accuracy and fidelity and reliability of the forecasting of the onset and severity of the monsoon? This is really important because there are something like 80 million smallholder farmers in India whose entire agricultural methodology relies on knowing when the monsoon is going to start. And what it's going to look like. This is how they make their planning decisions. It's how they make their decisions about how they're going to spend their time off farm for making money elsewhere. So they were able to create this model that improved massively the accuracy of the monsoon prediction. But they didn't stop there because they realized that just doing that does not make it useful to people. Right? It does not make it useful to the farmers. It does not make it used by the farmers. And so they partnered and worked extremely closely with the Indian Ministry of Agriculture to ensure that that forecast was delivered to the farmers. To I think they got it to 39 million farmers last planting season, in a way via the cell phones everyone has now that was usable and interpretable by them. And so again, this puts where is it in these human systems that are going to continue to be largely human systems, how can you learn to create sort of a translation methodology between the AI tools and the thing that actually enhances human welfare, right? And so I think that's like a really exciting place for folks, especially if you're not a computer geek. To think about opportunities in this space.
That's amazing. It's a great example of AI complementing human expertise. I do want to keep us on time. So what I want to do is I want to thank Kristina Costa for just fantastic comments. I know that people in the audience are going to be inspired by your career path, that they're at the beginning. People who are experts in the field have learned a lot from this session. And thank you for letting us do this fireside chat with you today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ronnie. Great to see you.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you.